We will go into the cartouches we see here in a minute. This is a facsimile from a text of a book that was released in 1902. So, you know. So chapter 7 is Dynasty VIII. Neb, Pa, Tet, Ra, Ahmes I, Ahmosis, 1700 BCE, circa. The dominion of Hyksos. Necessity gave rise to the profound internal division, alike in the different princely families and in the native population itself. Factions became rampant in various districts and reached their highest point in the hostile feeling of the inhabitants of Patoris, or the south country, against the people of Patamet, or the north country, who were much mixed with foreign blood. The indolent descendants of the royal races had made their residences in the centers of petty kingdoms, and, just as in the strong quarters of El Kab and Thebes, and in Kmun, the Hermopolis of the Greeks, and in Canensu, Heracleopolis, the upper land kept its branching dynasties from generation to generation, so the oppressed children of the ancient monarchs in the lower cities of Memphis, Xois, Zoan, Tanis, and elsewhere awaited a brilliant future of sole dominion over the reunited divisions of the empire of Horus and Set. So these first two here, we have Ra, Nebpeptet, and Ahmosis. From the condition of a divided power and of mutual jealousy, the foreign rulers obtained their advantage and their chief strength until King Ahmosis made himself supreme. Manning his ships with a sufficient number of warriors, he led them down the river to Memphis, and from thence dealt a death blow to the foreign governments in the hated city of Abaris. And so 1700, we have Ahmosis and Nefert, Uri. 1666 BC, we have Yemen Hateptep the first. Hatep was his wife. 633, we have Jehoshaphat the first. Ahmes married Yemen. Around 1600 BC, we have Knem Men, Hatshepsut, which is actually Yemen Nayeb Tahat Chepsu, who was married to, and we have Jehotimus Neferkspers. So Jehotimus, the second. We have Jehotimus Neferkspur. Oh, so we have a scene instead of at the end of this we always have Jehotimus. Ahmes is with a S, with a S instead of S. Okay. Hatshepsut married Ra. Uh, 566 BC, we have Yemen Nahateptep the second. 500 1533 BCE, we have Tuaa, or Thua, with Thua. So that's the queen, right? They gave birth to Thi. Tohotta Mas the fourth with Mut M Ua. 1500, Thi from Chua Thwa with Iman Nahatep the third. 1466, Hor'em Hub with Natchum Mut. And we have Neferre The with Iman Nahatuptup the fourth, Kutun Hatan. 1433, we have Sa Anakted Meratan Anksnas with Pa'atan Iman with Tut Anks Amen. Oh, I guess we have more listed here, so we'll I showed the tablet, here. So we'll return to that. Ahmathus, whose name signifies child of the moon, was certainly not of Theban origin. The moon was regarded as the celestial abode of Gahotta, the Egyptian Hermes, who was invoked by his disciples as the thought and will of who was considered to be the sun god Ra, his father. And remember, as a political model, I've talked about the right hand, bird. I mean the right wing bird, but anyways, according to custom, the name of this entity was decidedly chosen not only as the family name of King Ahmathus and his mother, Queen Ahahatep, but also of their descendants named Gahotta Mas, the child of Gahotta, whose sovereign ushered in the prosperous times of the 18th dynasty. Ahmathus attacked his enemies by land and sea, conquered Avaris, and pursued the hosts of the foreigners as far as the Canaanite town of Sharohan in the tomb chamber of Ahmes II, surnamed Penokhed, the country in which the king fought his eastern battles and in which Sharohan was situated, is designated by its collective name of Zahi. It is there related that Ahmathus served under 4 kings. I have reached a happy old age. I was during my existence in the favor of the king, and was rewarded by his majesty, and was beloved by the royal court, and a divine woman, the great queen, Ra Ma'atka. Hatshepsut, the justified, gave me a further reward because I brought up her daughter, the great princess Methru-Ra, the justified. I served King Ahmathus in a hand-to-hand combat. I gained 10 hands for him in the land of Zahe. I accompanied him to the land of Cush, living prisoners. I served King Gimmon Nahatuptup I. I gained for him 3 hands in a hand-to-hand combat in the north of Amu Kahak, and so forth. From this account of his life, it appears with certainty that the first campaign on foreign soil was against the land of Zahi, that is, against the Phoenician population before alluded to as the Karu. Ahmathus, after having driven the enemy out of Egypt, and sufficiently protected the eastern frontier of the Low Country by a line of fortresses, attempted to restore peace and order in the kingdom by gradually reducing the petty kings to submission. They remained as under kings in their several districts, and as such bore royal titles and received pharaonic homage. Thus, on the monuments by the side of Ahmasus, there appeared as legitimate princes and kings' sons, the princes Benupu, Watmes, Ahmasus, Sipar, etc., with their double names enclosed in a royal cartouche. It was only in such a manner that he was able to secure himself against insurrection and jealous opposition in the country, and also to lead his warriors from Patoris against the rebellious Negroes on the southern frontier of the country. By American standards, the Semites and the Egyptians, whether you consider them Semites or not, are black, but they were referring to the other races of Africa, right? Which are actually, instead of brown skin, black. Some of them are black skinned. So yeah. Taking advantage of the weakness of the empire during the foreign dominion, and the inhabitants of the Nubian districts threw off the yoke of the Pharaohs and even founded independent kingdoms in the valley near the cataracts, which the kings of the 12th dynasty had run almost step by step from their dusky neighbors. Ahmasus, the chief of the sailors, has already related how Ahmasus, the king, came out victorious from this struggle also, in which a king named Teton offered an obstinate resistance. Thus, not only were the two halves of the empire reunited under the powerful scepter of the pharaoh, but the south also was for a time again subjected to Egyptian supremacy. And at last, a time of leisure arrived, which allowed the king to prove his gratitude to whom he considered to be gods by embellishing, rebuilding, or enlarging their temples, which during the long dominion of the foreigners had fallen into decay. Ahmasus, in the 22nd year of his reign, reopened abandoned quarries in the Arab chain of mountains to obtain limestone for the building of the temples in Memphis, Thebes, and other principal cities of the kingdom. The following is a translation of the inscription on 2 rock tablets at Tura and Basara. In the year 22 of the reign of King Ahmasus, his majesty gave the order to open the rock chambers anew and to cut out thence the best white limestone, of the hill country, for the houses of, who they consider to be gods, whose existence is for endless years, for the house of the divine Ptah, and Memphis, for Yemen, the gracious, they consider to be God, and Thebes, and for all other monuments that his majesty caused to be executed. The stone was drawn by bullocks, which were brought thither and given over to the foreign people of the Pharaohs. The fact which the inscription relates about the drawing of the stone by oxen is represented beneath it in the picture. 6 pairs of oxen are drawing a block of stone by the help of a kind of sledge. But the building of the Egyptian sanctuaries occupied centuries. The immense imperial tomb of whom they considered to be a god, Amun, Thebes, in the neighborhood of the modern Arab village of Karnak, was begun in the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ. But down to the 13th century, the work had only reached a partial completion. It is proved by the inscriptions even to the very year and day that the rebuilding under the Ptolemies of the great temple of the sun at Edfu occupied the architects with a slight interruption in the progress of the work. For 180 years, 3 months, and 14 days from the year 237 BCE to the year 57 BCE, Ahmasus, therefore, could not expect to see the completion of the work he had begun, and in fact was reserved for his late descendants to finish, according to the ancient plan, the buildings he commenced. The name of Ahmasus as a builder has fallen into oblivion on the walls of the Theban temples, but the rock tablets of Masara have preserved the remembrance of him and his wife, the great queen. So the temple of Edfu, built under the Ptolemies BCE 237 to 57, the top pylons with the staircase leading to the top, the first hall with the peristyle, the second hall, the third hall, a small chamber communicating the staircases, one leading to the roof, the other to numerous small passages, another small chamber, the sanctuary, in a corner of which is a magnificent monolith of gray granite, the shrine, Naas, of the hawk, which was the emblem of whom they considered to be a god, Hormku. And we see similarity between the whole Karnak, the Luxor and such, but the later Greeks did not employ as many references to consciousness and stuff like this, so there's less mystical use and experience as time goes on here. But you notice how the walls are, the building is squared, but it's kind of off north a bit for the original plan, which there are some reasons for that, but the first Iri Masas, that is the beautiful consort of Ahmasas, not only in the rock caves of Tura and Masara, opposite to Memphis, but also on a number of public monuments in the interior of the sepulchral chambers of the Theban necropolis. Has the name of this queen been preserved, surrounded by laudatory inscriptions long after her decease? This great ancestress of the new empire was venerated as a divine being, and her image was placed beside the throne of the eternal inhabitants of the Egyptian heaven. In the united assembly of the deified first kings of the new empire, this divine spouse of Ahmes sat enthroned at the head of all the pharaonic pairs, and before all the king's children of her race. As the revered founder of the 18th dynasty, she is the daughter, sister, wife, and mother of a king, beside being the wife of, aside being considered the wife of the god Gimmon. We see in the Bible the whole Azbal and Ahab thing, taking on that role as well. I'm like the god, and this is like the goddess, and we're taking the role. We're enacting these roles for the people. Rather common ancient theme for rulers, but particularly in Egypt, right? An expression which denoted the chief priestess of the tutelary alleged god of Thebes, but nothing more than that. I don't know about that. I would say sex magic with the king was like a special privilege that, other than access to the king, that there would have been, some secrets regarding that. But this isn't the time and place for sex magic talk, is it? Maybe. On several monuments, she is represented with a black skin, and the conclusion has since been drawn that she was descended from Negro stock. And despite of the ingenious surmises which have been put forward on the part of scholars to infer high political reasons from the color of her complexion, namely that this marriage was the seal of a treaty concluded by the pharaoh Ahmasus with the neighboring Negro tribes for a common effort to drive out the shepherd kings, it seems to me that in this supposition, two special points have been entirely left out of sight. Now, it seems that, was it Ra-Masus, the second, might have been descended from some European spouse of some pharaoh. Common effort to drive out the shepherd kings. It seems to me that is represented to special points of entire lifetime. First, the dark color was not seldom employed in the paintings of the king's tombs at Thebes in order by the contrast with the usual brightly colored pictures of the pharaohs to suggest a clearly visible allusion to their abode in the dark night of the grave. But we dig up the pharaohs and we find that their bone structure is more negroid than the people that we call black in America. So yeah, there's more to it than that. I mean, this intention of the painter would appear all the more probable on this case, as she does not on every occasion appear black, but sometimes with a yellow skin, like all native women. In the second place, the Negroes, with an Egyptian queen of their own race, would have earned a poor return of gratitude from the house of Egypt if Ahmasus, after the victory over his enemies in the north, had immediately turned his arms against his brethren and the people of his own wife, by whose help alone he had been able to attain the victory over his hereditary enemy. And we can turn to the royal mummies of Dar el-Bahari, page 362. Her son and successor was Sirkara Hattup. Sirkara, what is this? We have Ra Sirka. Okay, Ra Sirka. According to all appearances, Yemen-Nahattup was a child at his father's death, so that his mother, Nefert-iri, assumed the reins of government. When he grew up, the young pharaoh turned his attention to the south and led a campaign against the land of Kush, in which the brave warrior Ahmasus, the son of Abana, took a part in the capacity of captain of the royal ships. His object, which was to extend the boundaries of Egypt, was fully attained, and besides this, a rich booty in captive Negroes and cattle was brought home. A second campaign was directed towards the north, where the Libyan people of the Ahmu Kahak had shown themselves hostile to the Egyptians. This people belonged to the great tribe of the light-colored Thuhin, or, as the Greeks designated them, the Marmar Da, whose country was known in classical times under the name of Marmarika. At the time they inhabited the northern coast of Africa. In this mention of the Ahmu Kahak are seen the first traces of that enmity under Meneptah II, assumed an aspect so threatening for the Egyptians. For the rest, those from the land of Thuhi considered themselves as cousins to the Egyptians. Towards the east, Yemen-Nahattup I remained inactive, and, like his predecessor, contented himself with protecting the frontiers. In the interior of the country, the inscriptions prove his erection of the great temple at Thebes, and of sanctuaries for the individual entities considered to be gods in the western part of the great Theban plain. After his death, divine honors were accorded to him as to his predecessors. He had by his consort Hattup a son, who was his successor on the throne, and as such bore the names Ahakheper, Kabra, Jahotmes the first. So let's turn back here. Ra Xpern, and we have Jahot the Firxpermus. His name, written by the Greeks, Thutmosis, means Dahotte's child. The victories and wars of this king, who, for the first time, undertook a campaign in the east as far as the banks of the Euphrates, form principal events in his history. The inscription in the tomb of Ahmasus, the captain of the ships, first mentions an expedition of Dahottemus against, the first, against the country of Khent Han-Nefer, an inclusive term which comprehended all the known countries in Africa situated to the west of the Nile as far as the north coast of Libya, in contradistinction to Kush, now called the Sudan. On a tract of such enormous extent, there naturally lived an immense number of tribes whose original stock was pure African. They are the black or brown Negro races called Ahasu on the monuments. Among these lighter colored tribes of Semitic or Kushite origin has settled themselves, whom a later monument of the time of the Ptolemies calls by the name of Seti, according to the situation of those countries and inhabitants of these tribes, which is substituted for the Egyptian appellations of Ta, Kent, and Cush, the better known names of Nubia and Ethiopia, and in like manner had translated Nahasu by Negros and Anu by Cushites. For all these nations, as well as for the Egyptians, the Nile afforded the one great waterway. In spite of all the efforts of the inhabitants of these remote regions to bid defiance to the Egyptian kings and to destroy their monuments, there are still traces enough left to prove their supremacy. Among them, the names of Dahottemus I is not wanting, for the rocks in the neighborhood of the cataracts of Kerman, the third cataract, have preserved the remembrance of his great deeds, and relate how Dahottemus I had taken possession of the throne of Horus in order to extend the boundaries of the Ba'id, how, in the territory of in the quarter of Thebes, called Kate Nebs, the inhabitants of the desert, Harusha, and the Aamu, and all foreign nations were obliged to work, how the northern people of Keba'u Neb are bowed down, and the Agabat Libyans are quelled. How peace is now there, because the inhabitants of the southern lands are driven downward and the northern people are driven upward, and they have altogether subjected themselves to the king. How the inhabitants of the inner regions hastened to Pharaoh to bow down before his throne. How he smote the king of Anu, the Cushites, and of the Negroes, how the Anu of Nubia were hewn in pieces and scattered all over their lands, and how their stench filled the valleys. Then the inscription continues, the lords of the great king's house have made a frontier garrison for his warriors, so that they may not be surprised by the foreign tribes. They have gathered together like the young panther against the bull. He remains still, he is blinded. The king came even to the uttermost limits of his realm. He reached the extreme boundary by his mighty arm. He sought the battle, but found no one who would have offered him resistance. He opened the valleys which had remained unknown to his forefathers, and which had never beheld the wearers of the double crown. His southern boundary was at the beginning of this land, the northern boundary at that water, where the traveler downward turns for his upward journey. Never had this been the case under any other king. The inscription concludes with the words, the land in its complete extent lay at the feet of the king. The office of the governor of Cush, to which at first the real sons of the king, called the king's sons of Cush, laid claim, is mentioned for the first time under the rule of Dahottemus I on the wall of the temple at Semneh, where an official called Nahi, who had won his spurs under Ahmasus and Dahottemus I, was raised by the latter king to this new dignity. The richness of Nubia and Ethiopia made them most desirable objects of conquest, and the governors were at once sent to administer the land of Kush and collect the tribute. Now, don't view this at me sharing this as supporting of wars of conquest, and I do not believe in wars to force a change in religion, to acquire wealth and change borders or capture slaves. That's not what I'm here to support. Cattle and rare animals, panther skins, ivory, ebony, balsam, sweet-smelling resin, gold, and precious stones, as well as captive Negroes, all were brought into Pharaoh's treasury. The prisoners were many of them sent to work in the emerald mines at Wadi Magara, or the scorching country of Uat, to dig for gold. In the neighborhood of the local temples, villages sprang up, whose busy inhabitants were supported by the supplies of Egyptian grain, which their own soil denied them. The natives of the cataract districts were employed as sailors by the king. His generals and his merchants did not, nor did the reward of their labor fail them. When Pharaoh visited the Nubian country in his richly adorned Nile ship, there was no end to the wonder and admiration, the joy and the hurrahs, for the king and his courtiers bestowed rich gifts on the inhabitants. For it was well worth while for the kings to leave behind them generous presents, to teach the inhabitants that Pharaoh was the father and benefactor of his subjects. Then those dusky-colored men might well sing, "Hail to thee, King of Egypt, son of the foreign people! Thy name is great in the land of Cush, where the war cry resounded through the dwellings of the men. Great is thy power, thou beneficent ruler. It puts to shame the peoples, the Pharaoh, life, safety, health to him. He is a shining sun." After Jehoiada the first, in the first years of his reign, had undertaken a campaign against Cush, and had fixed the boundaries of his empire to the south. It seemed to him that the favorable moment had arrived to send troops eastward to attack the hated inhabitants of Asia. Thus began that great war of 500 years, which was carried on by successive pharaohs with almost uninterrupted good fortune. It may be as well to say a little about those Asiatic people. First of all, there were the wandering Shasu, whose chief territory was the mountainous country of Edom. Here the Badawi of antiquity lived like foxes in their holes, while the kindred tribes settled at the angle of the sea coast were generally faithful allies of the Egyptians. Their three chief places, Rhino Kolura, Ugas, and Jamnia, formed a sort of tripolis. After passing the fortress of Sharohan, the road touched the stronghold of Gaza. Along the edge of the sea lay Phoenicia, of which Ascalon, Joppa, Tyre, Sidon, Berotus were the principal places on the road till, in the valley of Eleutherus, at the northern slope of Lebanon, the ancient way took an easterly direction and finally opened into the wide plain of Kadesh on the Rontes, and thence into the heart of the land of the Amorites. Another much frequented, though dangerous road led from Gaza in a northerly direction along the whole length of the Jordan, the valley of the Leontes, and the Orontes had to be passed in order to reach from this side the same city of Kadesh in the land of the Amorites, Damascus, and the towns of Coele, Syria, were left to the east on the other side of the Anti-Libanus, Carchemish, and Caliban being the last halting places on the road in Syria proper, which was bounded on the east by the broad waterway of the Euphrates, while on the west the chain of Mount Amanus and the spurs of the Taurus range set a limit to the further march of the great army. The whole of this territory was divided into a number of small kingdoms, the names of which were commonly connected with the fortified capital, and which were inhabited by races whose exact designations are as yet unknown. The Hittites, Archeta, held a distinguished place among them, while the kingdoms of Carchemish, Kadesh, and Megiddo were looked upon as the most important points for defense and attack, and as general gathering places for the allied kings. The Egyptian inscriptions of this period frequently mention the name of Naharain, or land of the two rivers, as a large country in the neighborhood of the upper Ruthin. It is generally understood to be in the country of Mesopotamia. The Arabs at the present day are accustomed to call the fertile country to the west of Damascus, which is watered by many rivers, by the name of Naharain. Thutmosis I chose as the object of his campaign against the east this land of Naharain. The two contemporaries and namesakes Ahmethus already mentioned agree completely in their accounts of this expedition which the king undertook in order to wash his heart, i.e., to satisfy his anger against the inhabitants of the land of Ruthen. He won the victory and took numerous prisoners besides horses and chariots of war. This campaign was the beginning of a brisk trade between the Nile and the Euphrates, which lasted through many centuries. Trade and art went hand in hand. The descriptions of the chariots of war, which blazed with gold and silver, of armor and weapons, from the most beautiful coats of mail to richly ornamented lances, of the vessels of gold and silver and bronze, of the household furniture down to the tent poles and footstools, and those thousand small objects which appear necessities to civilized men, represented the art and civilization of that day. Long before the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey appear on the battlefield of their ornamental armor, the kings and marinas of the land of Canaan careered in brazen harness in their war chariots over the plains of Shinar and Mesopotamia and the valleys of Palestine to measure themselves in battle with the warriors of Egypt. In the conduct of war also, their Asiatic neighbors exercised an influence on the Egyptian military administration. The distribution and arrangement of the troops and the position of the leaders were carefully settled, from the common soldier to the highest general. The horse was now introduced into the valley of the Nile under his Semitic name of Sus, and the war chariot with its pair of gray horses, and henceforward took a prominent place in the Egyptian order of battle. In the tomb of the brave warrior Ahmethus at Al-Kab, there appears a picture of a pair of horses with the chariot. The driver, Kazan, standing behind the chariot, holding the reins, waits for his lord, who loves the clever steeds. The king returned victorious from his campaign against Naharain, crowned with glory and laden with booty. He entered Thebes, and as a lasting monument in remembrance of his expedition, caused a tablet to be set up on which were inscribed his victories. He further showed his thankfulness to Yemen by continuing the works begun by his forefathers at Karnak. The temple, which was at that time small and surrounded by a wall with rows of chambers built against it, received on the western side an addition of massive buildings and rows of columns, and in front of These two granite obelisks, covered with inscriptions, were to serve as witnesses of the prowess of the king and his piety towards what he considered to be gods. It seems that Jehoiada the first enjoyed but a comparatively short life and reign. With this agrees the fact that the two Ahmasus, as well as Nahi, the governor of the southern country, were able to serve their country faithfully under the first four pharaohs of this dynasty. Jehoiada the first left behind him three children, an heiress daughter and favorite of her father, the bold and able Hatshepsut. Ra. Shep. Khan. Okay. This favorite child of the late king, superior to her brother, both in courage and capacity, risked everything to get the government into her own hands. Whether the means she took to serve her end were legitimate is now difficult to decide. But the fact is certain that they met with a hostile reception, for after the death of her elder brother, she erased his name from the monuments with the greatest care, a token of the unfriendly feeling that existed between the brother and sister. As an heiress, whom her father had, in his lifetime, already allowed to take part in the affairs of government, she felt herself strengthened by the influence of her position, and her birth, like that by which her mother, Ahatep, herself the daughter of the legitimate king of the old race, had held so distinguished a place. Jehoiada II reigned only a short time in conjunction with his sister. He succeeded, however, in conducting a campaign against the southern people, as well as another against his neighbors, the Shasu, on the eastern frontier, who had attempted an attack upon the Egyptian lowlands. A rock tablet in the neighborhood of Aswan informs the wayfarer of the relations of the king with the southern country. It commences with the date of the 8th Paofi in the first year of his reign. On the left bank of the stream, the twofold names of the royal brother and sister were especially recorded on buildings on the site of the modern Medinat Habu, called by the special name of the mountain of Neb-Unks, that is, the Coffin Mountain, on account of the tombs which are found there, and on those at the place called Dar el-Bahari. At the site last named, in the northwestern corner of the Theban valley, the white limestone rocks rise steep and abruptly from the plain. On the left hand, where the hill of Gurna juts into the plain, not far from Dar el-Bahari, the rock is penetrated by thousands of caves, which lead to the chambers of the dead. Here the queen resolved that a magnificent sepulchre should be hewn in the rock, with a temple to the dead in front of it, in memory of the princes of the royal house, the like of which should not be found again in Egypt, while the steep wall of rock was pierced with grottos in the shape of vast halls, which served as sacrificial chambers to the yet undiscovered tombs of the families of the race of Jehoiada, richly adorned with variegated representations and corresponding inscriptions of pious import. There rose in front a gigantic temple in the form of a long, extensive building, approached by broad steps which descended to the plain, a sacred avenue, dramas, bordered on each side by sphinxes, led in an easterly direction to the river. Such was the splendid erection of Queen Ra Shupsuka, which called to mind the wonderful buildings on the banks of the Euphrates that have been so often described, in the subterranean chambers which have not yet been discovered in the interior of the steep wall of rock, and perhaps connected with the tombs of the kings which lie behind them in the valley of Biban el-Moluk, were placed the bodies of Jehotamas I and his wife and sister Queen Ahmasus. Here repose near their parents, the Princess Ra, who died young, by her side Jehotamas at his restless, ambitious consort at Chepsu, and lastly the Pharaoh Jehotamas. Scarcely had the brother and husband of Ra Shupsuka closed his eyes when the proud queen laid aside her woman's dress, clothed herself in man's attire, and adorned herself with crown and insignia of royalty. She assumed the sole government of the country, while her younger brother Jehotamas III was put aside. Her name was now to be expanded to Ma'at Raksnem Yemen. The first deed of the new woman king shows her hatred of her deceased brother and husband, whose memory she sought to obliterate in every conceivable manner. Yeah, if you're forced to marry your sibling, I get it. She erased his names from the monuments they had erected together and replaced them by her own or those of her father. The buildings which had been planned on a great scale were now continued, and before all others at the stage temple of Deir el-Bahari was carried to completion by untiring efforts. The friend and architect of the queen was named Senmut, the son of Ra Masu and of Hadnefer. After his death, the queen raised to him, as a mark of gratitude, a stone monument and his likeness in black granite in a sitting posture, and on the right shoulder was the short but significant inscription, Nan Kam An Apu. His ancestors were not found in writing. In the inscriptions on his monument, he abstains from mentioning the woman king otherwise than as he, for thus the will of the queen commanded. I lived under the lord of the country, the king Ma'atkara. May he live forever. Oh, this is Ra Ma'atkara. Okay. I was a distinguished man who loved him and who gained for myself the admiration of the lord of the country. He made me great in the country. He named me as the chief steward of his house and as the governor of the whole country. So I became the first of the first and the master of the works, of all masters of the works. The buildings of Ra Matka are some of the most tasteful, most complete, and brilliant creations the hands of the Egyptians. The hand of the Egyptian artist ever wrought. They belong to the time of the matchless splendor of Egyptian art, whether as regards the manipulation of the stone, or the form and manner of the execution, or the effect of the rich colored decoration. Even in their ruin, they exercise a wonderful charm on the spoilt taste of modern times. Hatshepsut's desire for the glory and a certain adventurous turn of mind caused her to look toward the remote shores of the Indian Ocean, and a voyage of discovery must be accomplished to the land of Punt, the cradle of many marvelous stories told by seafaring men. The front walls of the stage temple of Dar el-Bahari are covered with colored sculptures and inscriptions, of which the representation that has become so famous of the expedition by sea to the balsam land of Punt is conspicuous above all the rest. Incited thereto by the oracle of Iman, the queen determined to undertake a voyage of discovery to this unknown land. The Egyptians were acquainted from hearsay with the wonders of that distant region on the coasts of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, the home of the pine incense so much coveted for the service of the temples, and of many other precious products of the soil. In the region that I'm at, cedar seems to be a more common choice of incense as far as a tree. Although, I mean, one that sticks out that, oh, well, they're selling cedar, but they're not really selling pine incense. But then they sell, but there's all that pine scented stuff for Christmas and whatnot. But a number of seagoing ships were prepared for the voyage. They were manned by able seamen and warriors, and a profusion of friendly gifts was not forgotten. Let me pause for a second here. A royal ambassador accompanied the expedition with many noble princes and lords. How long the voyage lasted, the inscriptions do not state. When the fleet had reached its destination, a landing was made on the coast of the Incense Terraced Mountain, near Cape Guardafui. Then each of the princes of the land of Punt approached with rich and costly gifts as offerings to the holiness of Hathor, the lady of Punt. You know, the one they Hathor they was who they worshipped as a cow goddess, of whom the Egyptian queen is the living image. The inhabitants of the apparently lived on pile buildings in little dome-shaped huts, the entrance to which was effected by a ladder under the shade of coconut palms laden with fruit and splendid incense trees, on whose boughs strange birds rocked themselves and whose feet stately herds of cattle peacefully reposed. The picture shows the royal ambassador, accompanied by his warriors, as in the act of receiving a number of chains, rings, hatchets, and daggers. The presence of the Prince of Punt, Pharaohs, who accompanied by his wife, Ari, his two sons, and his daughter, greets the royal ambassador with uplifted arms. A donkey serves to carry his enormously fat wife. The appended word runs thus: the princes of the land of Punt have arrived, bowing themselves in greeting to receive these warriors of the queen. They praise and exalt the king, of whom are considered to be gods, Gimen Ra. As appears from the continuation of the inscription, they express their natural astonishment that it was possible for foreign men to reach such a distant and unknown country, and they add the prayer that the queen, the mighty ruler of Egypt, would grant them peace and freedom. The royal ambassador, ready to take into account the peaceful desires of the princes of Punt, on his side puts forward the condition that the country of Punt should be subjected to the supremacy of the Queen of Egypt, as also that some of the products of the country, and particularly incense, should be delivered as tribute to the royal court. The ambassador and his suite had, in the meantime, pitched their camp on the seashore. That this was done with the friendly intention of receiving the princes of Punt, whose favorable answer must have been given, and of entertaining them hospitably as the friends of the Egyptian queen, is shown in the clearest manner by the inscription. The camp of tents of the royal ambassador and his warriors was pitched in the neighborhood of the balsam-terraced mountain of the country Apunt, on the shore of the great sea, to receive the princess of the country. There was offered to them bread, mead, wine, meat, and dried fruits, and everything else from the country of Temera, Egypt, just as the royal court had ordered. The chief representative of the princes of Punt, Parihu, who was mentioned above, accompanied by his wife, did not keep them in waiting for. The princes of Punt came, bringing with him the tribute to the shore of the great sea. Golden rings, ivory, and a great heap of precious balsams were laid out before the tents. Inhabitants of Punt, bearing loads and drivers, leading laden donkeys with herds of cattle behind, showed clearly the willingness of the natives to submit themselves to the Egyptian sovereign. The ambassador of the queen received the gifts of the prince of Punt. Thereupon, peace and friendship were concluded, and everything was prepared for the return home. The treasures of stones and plants and animals which Punt had cheerfully offered to the Egyptians were increased by a singular addition, which presents to us the first and oldest attempt of which we have any record. To transplant a tree to a foreign soil, 31 incense trees packed in tubs were dragged to the shore by the natives. 6 men toiled under the burden of each tree. When all the products of the land stood ready for embarkation, the difficult work and packing and loading commenced. The picture shows us the labors of the sailors and of the natives. The inscription explains that the ships were laden to the uttermost with the wonderful products of the land of Punt, and with the different precious woods of the divine land, and with heaps of the resin of incense, with fresh incense trees, with ebony, of ivory set in pure gold from the land of Amu, with sweet woods, cusset wood, with aham incense, holy resin, and paint for the eyes, with dog-headed apes, with long-tailed monkeys, and greyhounds, with leopard skins, and with natives of the country, together with their children. Never was the like brought to any king since the world stands. Soon the ships were set in motion. Sails and oars had to help alternately. The incense trees stood on deck between chests and stacks. To the great amusement of the voyagers, the apes sprang about here and there in full freedom among the sails. The inscription added to the picture informs us that among the people who traveled with them were even princes of the land of Punt. The warriors of the lord of the land betake themselves to the ship. They return happily home. They take the road to Thebes in joyfulness of heart. The princes are with them from this country. What they bring is of a kind, the like of which was never brought to any other king. The return of the fleet to Thebes must, of course, have been celebrated as a great event. Egypt had quietly become possessed of a newly discovered region in the east, and with it the wealth of most precious productions of this El Dorado, mythical land of gold. In a solemn court, the queen received the princes of the tribes, who respectfully prostrated themselves before her, who had now become their queen, and in the usual court language, their solemn address designated her as the Queen of Temera. Which was a way of talking about the Egyptians, right? And the sun who shines like the disk of heaven, not without, at the same time addressing her as their queen and as ruler of Punt. They have now become the subjects of her majesty. In a long procession, the beasts and the other natural products were brought before the queen. Even the heavy incense trees were dragged past her. In consequence of the fortunate result, this voyage which carried the Egyptian name to the coast of Africa and opened new sources of wealth, it was proper and natural to dedicate the treasures which had been brought home to Amen and to institute grand festivals in his honor. Pictures and inscriptions leave not the slightest doubt upon this point. The woman king appeared in full royal attire, honored by the most distinguished insignia of her dignity, before the great entity to testify her gratitude, and to prove the same in very deed by the dedication and presentation of all the treasures which had been brought home from the distant south. The productions apunt were heaped up in groups, and the incense trees were planted in Egyptian soil. Giraffes, panthers, hunting leopards, bulls, panther skins, gold, copper, ebony, and other woods fit for building purposes, called amu timber, ivory, paint for the eyes, cash, and whole mountains of precious incense resin were offered to the entity, and the number and measure of them inscribed in the temple books. This last act is shown in a symbolical manner in the picture, where Jehote as a divine temple scribe, and Saphek shown as a goddess of libraries, write down on the roll of a book the pieces weighed out and counted over by Horus. And the S is not her, it's just plain her in Egyptian, but the exact and just scales of Gahote, which the queen had prepared for her father, the Theban Ibn, in order to weigh out silver, gold, blue stone, green stone, and all other precious stones. So run the words. On the one scale lie 31 rings of precious metal, and on the other scale the 10 are pound weights in the shape of reclining oxen, and the smaller weights in the forms of heads of oxen and bricks. The present occupation of her, the watcher of the scale, is designated as the weighing out of the gold and silver and copper, and the works of the inhabitants of the south for the Theban Yemen. In the picture below, the spectator sees 2 large heaps of incense resin. 4 men are occupied in determining the amount exactly with a hollow measure. An inscription above it says, "Very active measuring of the fresh incense for the Theban Yemen, from the most wonderful of lands, that apunt of the most excellent of the land of God." With these transactions there was connected a great feast in honor of Yemen. The queen herself was arrayed in a spotted leopard skin with copper clasps, and her limbs were perfumed like freshly fallen dew. All the inhabitants gave utterance to their joy in song and music. The brother of the queen, Munspur Ra, had the honor of presenting an offering of the best incense to the holy bark of Yemen, which was borne in solemn procession on the shoulders of the officiating priests, a long procession of whom, with court officials, warriors, and people bearing palm branches, approached the temple of the divine protector of Thebes. Closely connected with these events was the dedication of the temple to the tutelary entities Yemen and Hatar, in which the king of Punt and his nobles took part. Ra Ma'at Ka's reign was not weakened by external enemies. In the east, the Canaanite kings left Egypt unmolested, and rather showed their friendly feeling by sending the tribute imposed upon them. And in the south, governors delivered to the court the products of their country. In the meantime, Jehote grew up to manhood, and according to the Egyptian law, claimed a share in the throne, which his sister could not withhold from him, and yielding to force, she placed beside her on the throne as associate king, the rightful heir to the crown and lineal representative of the royal house, with deep rancor in his heart. How do you say this guy who's the third? Jahota Neferkspurmus. Assumed the royal dignity. His first exercise of kingly power bears the date of the year 15 on the 27th day of the month Pakans. A rock tablet at Wadi Magara exhibits the two sovereigns, Ra Ma'atka and Dahopta Neferkspurmus the third, united in presenting their offerings to Sapt and Hatur, the protecting entities of the district. The inscription begins with the date of the year 16. A year previously, a work had been begun which claims attention for two reasons. On the plinth of one of the obelisks of rose granite with which the queen adorned the great temple at Karnak, there is a historical statement, the chief contents of which are as follows. The woman king, so to translate by an approximate phrase of the masculine style in which the queen speaks of herself, had cut out the work in question from the wall of rock in the Red Mountains of Aswan, and had raised it in its place in the inconceivably short space of 7 months, namely from the first day of the month Mekher of the 15th year of her reign, on the last of Mesori of the following 16th year. If such was the case, the commencement of the first year of her reign must have fallen in the time between the 2 months. Consequently, the reckoning of the regnal year does not begin according to the system hitherto received from the first day of that year in which she ascended the throne as king. This assumption of the real day of her ascension to the throne is fully confirmed by the date from the reign of Jahoteh Neferkspurmus the third, who, according to the authority of the monuments, ascended the throne of Egypt on the 4th day of the month Pakans. In agreement with this, the great tablet of victories at Karnak announces the same king in the 22nd year of his reign in the month from Buthi left the Egyptian frontier to arrive at Gaza a few days later in the 23rd year on the day of his coronation, the 4th of Pakans, according to the inscription in the tomb of his contemporary Yemen Mahab, the Adon of the warriors. The king died on the last day of the month of Famanath in the 54th year of his reign. Jahoteh Neferkspur the third, according, reigned exactly 53 years, 11 months, and 1 day. That is, including the years of his sister's reign, whose sole rule appeared to him unjust and illegal. With this length of his reign, the Manathanian records of 12 years for the double reign of the two together, and 26 for his sole reign, in no way agree. A striking example and proof of the corrupt form in which Anatho's numbers have come down to us. The date on the plinth of the obelisk named above can now be perfectly explained. The 15th year ends with the 3rd of Pakans, and the 4th of the same month begin in the 16th year. Thus they labored at this work for 3 months and 3 days of the 15th year, and 3 months and 27 days of the 16th year, altogether, therefore, for just 7 full months. Whether Jahoteh Neferkspurmus the third, after reaching manhood, drove his sister by force from the throne, or whether she quietly passed out of life, we have not the means of knowing, as the monuments are silent on the point. And yet another chapter regarding the history is as follows. Sharma.